ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
The US Supreme Court has delivered Donald Trump a major legal victory, ruling that presidents have significant protection from criminal prosecutions. It sets back efforts to prosecute Trump with charges of trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election result. And it gives extraordinary immunity to presidents, putting actions deemed to be official beyond the reach of the justice system. I'm Melissa Clark in Canberra on Ngunnawal country and recognising other custodians. This is ABC News Daily.
I'm Rick Hasen. I'm a professor of law at UCLA School of Law, and I direct the Safeguarding Democracy Project.
Rick, what was the Supreme Court ruling and what does it tell us about presidential immunity from prosecution?
The Supreme Court divided along party lines in granting Donald Trump a wide berth of immunity.
In a landmark decision, the US Supreme Court has ruled former President Donald Trump is entitled to absolute immunity from prosecution for some official acts while in office.
The court found that Donald Trump and any former president really has pretty significant immunity for anything they did which could be classed as an official act.
Donald Trump has welcomed the court's ruling, writing on his Truth Social platform, "Big win for our Constitution and democracy, proud to be an American."
At the very least, it's given him a delay in being brought to trial on charges related to 2020 election subversion attempts. And it could even lead to those charges never being brought should Donald Trump win election in 2024. And so it is a big victory for Donald Trump, and it is more broadly a big shift of power towards the power of the presidency and towards the power of the courts to determine the limits of the power of the presidency.
Can you tell me the division amongst the justices on the Supreme Court and how the numbers fell when it came to this decision?
So the court has 6 Republican-appointed justices. They were all in the majority. It has 3 Democratic-appointed justices. They were all in the dissent. There was a slight bit of difference with one of the Republican-appointed justices, Amy Coney Barrett, but it was a relatively minor point. The dissenting justices said that this essentially makes the president into a king and that this is a fundamental reworking of the relative powers of the different branches of government in the United States.
And US President Joe Biden has been scathing in his immediate response, saying there are virtually no limits to what a president can do.
This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed, and it's a dangerous precedent.
So, Rick, let's look at the detail of exactly what the Supreme Court has ruled. To what extent does a president or ex-president have immunity from prosecution?
It's a very complex ruling. It doesn't give an on-off switch. It instead divides the world into 3 categories of cases. Some cases where the president is engaged in his core functions, such as if he's doing something as commander-in-chief or he's talking to his Justice Department, there he would have absolute immunity, couldn't go after him at all. Then there are things that go up to what the court called the outer perimeter of his conduct. This could include things like speaking to the vice president about how he's going to run the counting of the Electoral College votes, as we saw on January 6, 2021, or giving a public speech, as he gave on January 6, just before the Capitol was stormed. There, the court said there's a presumption of immunity, but it could be overcome with a, kind of deliberate, careful, factual determination as to whether, if you overcome that immunity, it wouldn't undermine the president's powers. And then there's the purely unofficial private stuff for which there is no immunity. And so the case is being sent back to the lower court to kind of parse out all the things that were alleged and to separate out the permissible things that could go into a criminal indictment and the things that could not.
Okay, so the Chief Justice John Roberts writes that presidential immunity, that, quote, he is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts. There is no immunity for unofficial acts, end quote. So can you take me through the rationale of why a president should have this level of immunity from the majority of the justices and why the dissenting justices disagreed?
So I think here there was a relatively clear line. The majority was mostly worried about what would happen with prosecutorial overreaching against future ex-presidents. The idea is that every ex-president would now face the threat of vaguely worded statutes being applied against them criminally, and this would chill presidential activity to fully engage in the actions of the office of the president. So they're concerned about some future curtailing of presidential power by the threat of an overzealous prosecutor. The dissenters had a very different view. They saw what Donald Trump did in the aftermath of the 2020 election as itself a great danger to democracy. They don't see those actions as things that are or should be protected by the Constitution. They said there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly requires this kind of immunity. It's very dangerous for democracy to make the president be above the law, and we need to deal with the threat today, not some hypothetical future threat down the line.
One of the dissenting justices warned that it would mean a president would be insulated from criminal prosecution if they ordered the Navy SEALs to assassinate a political rival or organised a political coup to hang on to power, even that it would mean that they would be immune if they took a bribe in exchange for a pardon. Immune, immune, immune. Pretty extraordinary stuff for a court judgment.
So the dissenting Justice Sotomayor, she wrote the primary dissent, and she talked about all the things like bribery for a pardon. Justice Jackson, in her separate dissent, said, we don't know where this line is. We know the president has the power to remove the attorney general, but what if the president tries to remove the attorney general by poisoning him? Where is that line? And I think the majority opinion left a lot of these issues open. The majority opinion protested and said, we're not deciding very much today. These are going to be intense factual and legal determinations that are going to be going through the court system. And so the parade of horribles is not something that's likely. To which the dissenting Justice Jackson said, well, now you've not only given more power to the presidency, you've given more power to the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court alone that decides when something crosses the line and can be the basis for criminal activity.
Yes, in this ruling, the Supreme Court has already indicated that President Trump would have complete immunity from discussions with Justice Department officials and that he would have presumptive immunity for interactions with Vice President Mike Pence. So I guess the question that remains with the court is when, if ever, a president is engaging in official acts. Before today's US Supreme Court ruling, what was our understanding of what protections a US president has?
Well, the courts had never really weighed in on the question of whether or not a president has immunity from criminal prosecution after he leaves office for the activities that he engaged in. The lower courts had said that there would be no immunity for these actions, that the president is not above the law, and that if the allegations in the complaint were true, he could go to trial on these issues. The U.S. Supreme Court disagreed and sent the case back for further deliberations under a new test.
Looking at the broader sweep of US history, there has been over time changes around the powers of the president, the judiciary and Congress. Is this court ruling part of that evolution?
This is a pretty large change. It's a pretty big shift of power to the president as a person. It ironically comes in the same month that the Supreme Court in other cases has cut back on the power of the president's agencies to be able to pass environmental and safety and consumer protection regulations. There have been a series of cases where the court has cut back on the administrative state. And so there is right now, with this supermajority of conservative justices on the Supreme Court, a pretty large shift in the balance of power. It empowers the president, in particular as a person, but it also empowers the judiciary as really being in ultimate deciding position when it comes to many of the major questions in American life and democracy.
Let's go back to the case that prompted this Supreme Court ruling. Can you remind us of the criminal charges Donald Trump is facing over his actions around the 2020 election?
So he's charged with essentially 3 buckets of crimes. One involves attempting to impede or obstruct an official proceeding, and this is by coming up with fake slates of presidential electors that might have been chosen for him in states that Joe Biden had actually won. One is essentially depriving the American people of their right to vote by trying to change the outcome to turn himself from an election loser into election winner. And one is essentially fraud against the United States by engaging in actions that prevent the fair working of government. And the majority said these crimes, or at least some of these crimes, are broad enough that they could provide the basis for spurious charges to be brought against a former president, and that this was a real danger. The dissenters thought that the facts here were so strong against Trump that they should be the basis for a criminal prosecution. And notably, the majority never comes out and condemns any of Trump's actions. They describe what's alleged in the indictment, but they never say anything about the importance of peaceful transitions of power or protecting democracy. All they seemed to care about was not undermining the power of the president.
So what does this mean then for the future of those charges if lower courts are now assessing whether or not these actions fall under core functions or outer perimeter functions or private functions of an individual? What does that legal process look like?
Well, it's going to go back to the district court. The district court's going to have to do a lot of parsing. There's going to be a lot of paperwork that's going to go back and forth. And if Donald Trump is not elected in November, it will be in many months, if not years, before we get final resolution of a second round, probably going to the Supreme Court, on the allegations that would be permissible in this complaint. If Donald Trump is elected to office, he will just cause the Justice Department to shut down this litigation, and that will eventually get rid of this case entirely.
Would it be fair to describe these charges as the most serious of the many legal challenges Donald Trump is facing?
I considered that case the most important American criminal trial that could have happened in U.S. history because it was involved with the protection of our democracy. And now it's either going to be delayed or never take place.
What are the political consequences of this? Is this something that will be on people's minds when they vote in November in the presidential election?
Well, it's a very complex ruling, but what I think a lot of people will take out of this is that it is yet another Trump win. That is something that politically is going to benefit Trump because the court has essentially sided with him, and he got the most important thing that he wanted, which was to delay any potential trial either till after the 2024 election or until never. I think the public is not going to see a trial of Donald Trump for engaging in election subversion before the 2024 election.
Rick Hasen is a professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles. This episode was produced by Bridget Fitzgerald and Oscar Coleman. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Melissa Clark. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.